rightly called the ideological zealotry of rogue bureaucrats. This debate will determine if we're about to enter a new era when common sense can be restored to our public policy and a sensible balance restored between environmental and human needs. I welcome that debate, and I ask for adoption of the rule to bring it forward. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Andrews.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend for yielding. 174 days ago, the President of the United States came to this floor, made a series of proposals to help small businesses and big businesses create jobs for the American people. Only one element of that jobs plan has been dealt with belatedly, which is an extension of the middle-class tax cut. There's been no vote on a bill to create construction jobs, rebuilding our libraries and schools. No vote on a bill to cut taxes for small businesses that create jobs. No vote on bills that would put our police officers and firefighters back on the job, our teachers back in the classroom. Nothing. Now, the bill that's before us today is very important, not just for California but for the country. It's something that needs to be taken up, and I respect all views on all sides. But I think it's time that the House leadership respected the urgent economic problems of this country. Now, since the President came here, there's been another increasingly urgent economic problem, and that is the manipulation of gasoline prices by speculators. And Americans are seeing the consequence of this at the pump every day. Members on our side have some ideas to stop this speculation and stop the pillaging of the wallets of American consumers at the gas pumps every day. Not surprisingly, that's not coming up for a vote either. The priorities of the House are misaligned with the priorities of the American people. Let's put on this floor legislation that creates jobs and gives relief to our people at the fuel pumps. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey yields back. The gentleman from Colorado reserves. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
I appreciate the gentleman from New Jersey's comments and would remind him also that the CVPA, the bill that started this problem, was actually authored by the senator from New Jersey at the time, and I appreciate that. This is one of those things we're trying to fix. I will yield gladly 1 minute to the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I first want to mention this to my friend from New Jersey, that we have several bills, including Keystone Pipeline, sitting over the Senate, will create tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of jobs. But yet Harry Reid does not seem that he would like to bring those to the floor. So we're doing our job here. Now, this bill today is about creating really a new environment for job creation and recognizing the human suffrage that has occurred in the Central Valley. I visited out there almost 2 years ago and have seen the level of employment and the human impact of this federal mandate upon California under the Endangered Species Act. What we've seen, and I don't know about the court case where it really raised some serious issues regarding the credibility behind the rule itself, but what I do know is this federal impact, if I could have an additional 30 seconds.
Yield an additional 30 seconds.
Recognized.
By adopting this bill today or passing this bill, we basically push the restart button so that entities that are hurt, environmentalists, can work together for an appropriate, balanced rule that protects people's livelihoods as well. So this should be a bipartisan bill. It came out of committee as a bipartisan bill. This is exactly the type of things that we should be working together and across the aisle. And I would encourage my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle to join with us and pass this bill.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Utah reserves. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Costa.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from Colorado. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the rule providing for the consideration of H.R. 1837. California's water system is broken. For too long, the San Joaquin Valley, which many of us represent, has borne the brunt of the water challenges facing our state. We have a water system designed for 20 million people. We have 38 million people today living in California. By the year 2030, we could have 50 million people. My district was and is ground zero for the hydrological and regulatory drought that occurred in 2009 and 2010. I was in the food lines where farm workers sadly had to find themselves in because there wasn't sufficient water to employ them. My constituents who rely on water for their livelihoods are looking for Congress to see that we are listening and care to work on real solutions that impact their future. Politics of water are not new in California nor in the West. They've existed for decades. I would hope that at some point we could put the politics aside. This debate is too important. It has been put off for too long. For the farmers, the farm workers, and the farm communities that I represent, I urge my colleagues to support this rule on a bipartisan basis. I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Colorado reserves. Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you. With gratitude to the last speaker, this may be about California water, but it impacts all of us who eat, and as you can tell, I'm one who does that very well. I will yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. McConnell.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the rule and the underlying bill. A bill which is a piece of bipartisan legislation was introduced not to serve mere partisans, but to serve real people, not to promote one's party, but to promote everyone's prosperity. And I say this in a true spirit of inclusion, as someone who comes from a manufacturing state, one whose auto companies stared into the abyss of potential bankruptcy. And it was a bipartisan coalition that helped to save it, and a policy that was put forward by a Republican president named Bush and continued by a Democratic president named Obama. Today, we must come together in a similar bipartisan fashion, for there is a federally dictated drought in the San Joaquin Valley, one that devastates farmers and all of our fellow Americans who live, and if they can, work there. To me, as someone who has watched and lived with my constituents through such an experience, I see no choice but for the federal government to rectify its legislatively imposed drought and allow the people of the San Joaquin Valley the same rights that we have to pursue our prosperity and continue to keep the fruits of our labor without the heavy hand of government coming in and making it more difficult for us to pursue and to create a better life for ourselves and for our children. And finally, on a note, I know that these are very contentious times, and one of the underlying issues regarding this bill is the Endangered Species Act. But whether you are wholeheartedly for the Endangered Species Act or wholeheartedly opposed, can we agree on one thing? The Endangered Species Act exists to preserve wildlife, not to impoverish human life. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Miller.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise in opposition to the rule, and I rise in opposition to the legislation. There's going to be an argument today about science. This bill makes it very simple. It ends that argument. It simply says that we will use the science that was in effect in 1994. We use the science that's, it's 18 years ago. That will be the science for the purposes of this legislation. You might as well tell the people of California to use the same telecommunication systems they had in 1994. No iPhones, no Blackberries, no advancement in knowledge, skills, or training, or technology. It's a pretty simplistic approach to scientists. You might say it's mindless. That the federal government is going to come in and tell the state of California that it cannot use its regulatory process or scientific process to determine what's best for its state. As the Attorney General of our state says, the federal government simply, and the Supreme Court says the federal government simply cannot commandeer the legislatures of the states. But that's what this legislation does. I love the fact that we have people here with wonderful conservative credentials who are now suggesting the federal government should preempt California law, preempt the California legislature, preempt the federal law, and go back to 1994. Where else would you take America back to 1994 in terms of imposing the will of the Congress on the states? And that's why almost all of the Western states, their water agencies, their executive offices oppose this legislation, because this is the greatest preemption of state water rights in the history of this country. The people who are supporting this is heavily subsidized farmers who have more than 1 or 2 or 3 subsidies from the federal government to grow their crops, are now insisting that the federal government take what is a contract right. It's a contract right. It's not that's it. They want to turn it into perpetuity. They want the water in perpetuity, and the hell with the rest of the state of California. That obviously isn't acceptable. That's not acceptable to any member of this Congress about their own state. Why is it acceptable all of a sudden to do that to the state of California? You simply cannot do this. We have in place a process that is working today for the first time in 40 years. And that's why the Resources Director of the state of California, that's why both of our senators are opposed to this process, because this group of people have never come together in the last 40 years to work on California problems. The urban users, the rural users, the ag interests, the manufacturing interests, the municipal interest, with the blessings of the state legislature that set out the guidelines, that set out the goals, that set out the purposes. That's going on today. Every party to that agreement except for this select few of special interest. This party is the only party that says blow it up. Use the United States Congress to blow up a process that for the first time has the possibility of solving the water problems in this state and making it sustainable for agriculture, for the environment, for manufacturing, and for municipal use in our state. Yes, we have a tough problem. We have 30 million people. The drought that they talk about that was imposed,
additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized
that was
for 30
a
seconds.
statewide drought. Yes, they lost some employment in farming, but in fact, agricultural employment, even through the drought, was pretty stable. The big employments in the Central Valley came because we were selling homes to people who couldn't pay for them. That was the crash. It was the first place and the longest crash that we have in this country in terms of mortgages and the loss of the people who were working in those trades. But that drought was felt across the state. Thousands of people lost their jobs in tourism in Northern California, in commercial fisheries, in recreational fisheries, in the bait shops, in the support services, all across our state. That drought was an equal destroyer of this California economy from north to south. Don't wreck this opportunity for California to settle California's
Gentleman's time
problems.
expired. The gentleman from Colorado reserves. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Utah reserves. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If we defeat the previous question, I'll offer an amendment to the rule to provide that immediately after the House adopts this rule, it will bring up H.R. 964, the Federal Price Gouging Prevention Act. Mr. Andrews mentioned that rather than discussing this, why aren't we tackling the big issues of the day, such as gas prices? Well, my colleague from New York, Mr. Bishop, has a proposal to do just that. To talk about his proposal, I'll yield 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Bishop.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this rule and urge the House to defeat the previous question so we can bring to the floor my bill today that would have an immediate impact on lowering gas prices. Leap Day arrives more often than a Republican energy plan. A year ago, when it became clear that the Republican leadership wouldn't help Americans fight rising gas prices, I introduced a bill that this motion is modeled after to crack down on speculation, which forces prices up artificially. This legislation makes it illegal to sell gasoline at excessive prices and prevents big oil from taking advantage of consumers by manipulating prices. This is real help for consumers in a tough economy. Domestic oil output is the highest it's been for 8 years. In fact, we've become a net exporter of gasoline, unable to consume all that we produce. And yet it's clear speculators are behind the spike in prices. They will never take delivery of oil, but they make up 64% of the market. When speculators place their bets that prices will rise, it follows that actual prices will rise. They have for 21 straight days. In that time, the average price per gallon went up 60 cents in my district. Still, the Republican leadership has yet to address market manipulation or turn off the spigot of subsidies for big oil, which made a record high $137 billion in profits last year, and that's up 75% from the profits they realized in 2010. We could invest in an energy plan that further expands domestic production, develops renewable sources, and forges a long-term strategy that weans us off Middle Eastern oil and protects consumers from rising gas prices over the long run. Mr. Speaker, let's make a leap to support American families by striking at the heart of rising gas prices. To that end, I urge my colleagues to support this motion. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Colorado reserves. The gentleman from Utah.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Utah reserves. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to talk about two issues here, one of which was discussed by my colleague from California, which is the bill that will be up later this afternoon. While the rule allows for amendments, some of the amendments that were proposed are not going to be before us. Specifically, this bill is a blatant attempt to do two things. One, steal 800,000 acre-feet of water and transfer it to heavily subsidized farmers on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. And secondly, completely overrule and override state law. And that's, I suppose, why states such as Colorado, Montana, New Mexico, Oregon, Wyoming, and the Western States Water Council, which is composed of the representatives of the governors of 16 western states, are all opposed to this bill. This is a terrible precedent. If you care anything about your state's ability to control their own destiny insofar as water is concerned, you do not want this bill to pass, because it is a blatant attempt by the west side farmers to simply grab water and take total control of the California water system. It blows away all of the environmental laws of the federal government and all of the environmental laws of the state of California, and even overrides the state constitution. I cannot think of a worse policy for anyone to be supporting if you care anything at all about states' rights. In addition to that, the bill totally destroys the efforts that have been underway to solve the problems that do exist in California water. There is absolutely not one new drop of water in this bill, but there is 800,000 acre-feet stolen and delivered to the southern water contractors. For many, many reasons, it ought to be defeated. And briefly on Mr. Bishop's attempt to have his bill heard on this floor, not a bad idea. And consider for a moment that there are 26 million gallons of gasoline exported from the United States every day. Something's wrong when that's occurring. At the same time, we're finding higher and higher gas prices. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Colorado continues reserved. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you. I'd remind the body once again that 9 out of the 10 amendments that were presented to were made in order. The only one that was not made in order had a question of its germaneness to the body here. I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, who does have a germane amendment that will be administered, that will be debated later on the floor. The gentleman from California, 3 minutes.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk on this. Not only in support of the rule, but in support of the bill. This is something we've went through in committee with very great debate, but it goes well beyond the debate of committee. We've debated this in the state of California for many, many years, if not decades now. But to have members from California come down to the floor and say that this is mindless, this is anything but mindless. These are jobs. You know, when you go down to Dennis Cardoza's district and see 30% unemployment in the Los Banos area, or down to Jim Costa's district and see 30 to 40% unemployment in Firebaugh or over in Mendota, mindless? Come down and talk to the people in our district and tell them that their jobs are mindless, that their homes are mindless, that their cars that they're having to give up are mindless. These are farm workers, these are individuals, these are farmers that we're seeing their families destroyed right now. Not mindless, and they're certainly not special interests. Come down to these districts. We invite the President on a bipartisan basis many times now. Come to California. Don't just go to L.A. and San Francisco, but come see the Central Valley and the challenges that we have. See how when the water is shut off, how we see our farms destroyed. But absolutely, this has impacts to the rest of the nation. If you want a safe food supply, if you want a reliable food supply, make sure we have reliable water delivery. And that's simply all this does. You know, any time that we talk about water throughout the nation, or certainly throughout California, it becomes a battle. You know, a lot is talked about pre-94, when a deal was a deal. That deal hasn't been changed by the farmers. That deal has been changed by members of Congress that have preempted state water rights. We want a deal. We want a deal every year. We want an agreement that says that if you're going to have a contract for 100% of your water, you actually get 100% of your water. But this year, because we had a lack of storage last year on the wettest of water years in California, this year we're going to have a 30% water allocation. We're still going to pay 100% of the cost of the contract, but have 30% of the water, which means, once again, we will see 30% unemployment in Jim Costa's district, in Dennis Cardozo's district, in my district, in many of the districts throughout the Central Valley. So before you start to ignore many of our agriculture acres and many of the jobs that go with it, let's come together in a bipartisan fashion, as we've done in the committee level, as we've done elsewhere within the state, but making sure that Republicans and Democrats are working together, but more importantly, that the House and Senate are working together. Now, I give a great deal of praise to the author of the bill, Congressman Nunes, for getting a regional perspective from this, getting North and South and Central California to actually work together. That is a tremendous accomplishment. But the bigger accomplishment is actually getting the Senate and the House to work together.
Additional 30 seconds.
It is time that we come up to a solution that avoids further cost, that avoids further delay, that avoids us having to continue to cut jobs in the Central Valley and in California. It's time to come to an agreement that will actually save the Central Valley and our farming industry and making sure that we've got certainty in water year in and year out. This bill will show the priority of the House. If the Senate has a different priority, let them show that. But the California public expects the Senate and the House to work together, just as we've come together in a bipartisan fashion on this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Utah reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson.
Gentleman from California is
I
recognized.
thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker and members, you know, I think it was Einstein that said if you start with the wrong numbers in your equation, you can never get to the correct solution. And what we just heard was a textbook perfect example of that. The idea that there's 30 to 60,000 lost jobs as a result of what's happening south of the Delta, I don't know where those numbers came from, but you know, you're certainly welcome to your own opinion, but you're not welcome to your own facts. And the facts tell a whole different story. If you look at what UC Davis did, if you look at what the University of the Pacific did, UC Berkeley, all their numbers point to a loss associated with certain things, a loss of jobs associated with the drought, a loss of jobs associated with an endangered species. But these are in the hundreds or the single-digit thousands, not anywhere close to 30 or 60,000. We need to get this thing right. And my friend from California was absolutely correct when he called for us to work together. And that's exactly what we've been trying to do, to work together. This bill was crafted not with the stakeholders at the table. This bill was crafted in the proverbial back room with not all of the stakeholders present. None of us who have a legitimate dog in this fight were included in this. If this bill were to pass, there will be thousands of jobs lost. They'll be north of the Delta. There'll be farming jobs. There'll be fisheries jobs. There'll be recreational jobs. There'll be all kinds of jobs associated with the economy north of the Delta. You can't come to this floor with legislation that creates winners and losers in the marketplace without bringing everybody to the table to work on that. And that's exactly what this bill does. It creates winners and losers. It chooses jobs south of the Delta at the expense of jobs north of the Delta. That's wrong, and this bill should be defeated.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Colorado reserves. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sometimes it's hard to estimate jobs when you're thirsty, but I realize if there was even one job that is cost because of bad federal behavior, that is one job too many. I am happy to yield 2 minutes to my friend from Florida, Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad, sir, that you just mentioned that, because I just heard here that, no, it's not maybe X thousands of jobs that are going to be lost. It's X minus a few thousands of jobs that are going to be lost. What? Did I just hear that? I just did. You know, rarely do you see such a reckless and immoral disregard for American families, for American farmers, for American farm workers, for hard-working people than what we have in front of us and what this bill is trying to solve in a bipartisan way, because this does have bipartisan support. And I keep hearing about all this, you know, these horrors, but wait a second. Take a step back, Mr. Speaker. These are farmers who have been farming that very land for generations. For generations. This is not like that they're trying to do something new. They've been doing this for generations. And you imagine the circumstances that the federal government steps in and says, no, we're going to cut off your water. You're not going to be able to farm, and forget about those jobs. Go do something else just because some bureaucrat someplace decides that they found a fish all of a sudden after these farmers have been there for generations. You know, sometimes a little common sense has to prevail, and sometimes a little moral sense has to prevail. Let's stand up for these farmers who have been there for generations. Let's stand up for these farm workers, the poorest, hardest working individuals who have been there for generations. Let's say no to a federal government that thinks that, oh, just a few less jobs won't hurt, won't matter. This is grotesque. This is immoral. Let's stand up together in a bipartisan way to stand up for American families, for American farmers, like they deserve this Congress to do for them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I'd like to inquire of the other side how many speakers he has remaining. The gentleman from Utah, I'd like to inquire how many speakers he has remaining.
To be honest, I'm not quite sure. I know I have a speech, and there may be another one coming down here.
I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Colorado reserves. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Let me just give myself a couple of minutes, if I might.
Gentleman's recognized.
I had the opportunity of going down to California to one of the hearings where we met the farmers who were living in this particular area. I heard their anguish. I understood their anger. Their ability to make a living was being prohibited while we in Congress simply talked about unrealistic concepts. They were living in pain while we continued to talk, and actually our actions and talking were causing that particular pain. This bill is about trying to help people. This is time to put people in the forefront and put our ideology behind so that we can solve a problem that has been caused by us. Actually, Mr. Speaker, I'll take what time I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. This effort is to put forward legislation that creates harms that are inflicted by onerous, extreme, completely unbalanced federal regulations, which too often seem to favor a narrow special interest group constituency as opposed to a balanced approach to protect our environment while considering jobs and the needs of real human people. As many has been said already, our colleagues have put forth a program which unfortunately is causing massive unemployment in the San Joaquin Valley, causing thousands of acres of which were the most productive farmland to go fallow, and risks turning this productive area into a dust bowl, causing soil erosion. These are negative environmental and economic impacts that were not considered in the federal government's original decision but ought to have been and should be considered now. The unfortunate reality is that California's Central Valley is one place where our actions and other regulations have had a negative impact on the country, leaving those farmers in danger but also affecting all of us. If you are an artichoke lover, which I am not, 98% of those that sold in the supermarket are raised in San Joaquin Valley of California. For those that enjoy walnuts, I'm now 0 for 2, or almonds and garlic, which I finally like, 98% of those supplies come from California. Nearly all the domestic avocados, the nectarines, are raised in California. Just for the record, I'm 3 out of 6 for those particular food items. California's man-made drought does not just impact Californians. It touches each and every one of us in some way. The next time we go to the grocery store and stop and take a look at where these products are coming, the chances are it's pretty good they're coming from California's Central Valley. You can nearly have a complete food meal group just by looking at what comes out of a 10 square mile area in the Central Valley of California. As prices continue to rise at the grocery store for fresh produce of all kinds, you can be assured that some of the main drivers of those increased costs come from a combination of skyrocketing fuel costs under this administration's poor domestic energy production policies, as well as less domestic food caused by this water diversion. And ironically and sadly, in recent years, since the federal water takings, and that's takings by the federal government, more and more produce has found its way from other foreign sources to replace what should have been produced in our own particular country. This bill addresses that problem in a positive way by reinstating water rights to farmers from water that was unjustly taken away by federal regulations. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Utah reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I inquire of the gentleman if any additional speakers have presented themselves on his side.
I think I'm the last one.
Okay, then I'm prepared to close, and I will yield myself the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of the previous question amendment in the record along with extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
Thank you. My colleague, Mr. Bishop, has brought forth something that I think is an important national issue that my constituents have certainly been calling me about, and I know that there has been concern from across the country about rising gas prices, and if we defeat the rule and the previous question, we will be able to immediately bring forth Mr. Bishop's bill and a discussion about price gouging in gas prices. Mr. Speaker, this bill sets a dangerous precedent for preempting state water rights, leaving other states vulnerable to federal interference. This bill is opposed by the state of California, California's 2 senators, the leaders of both legislative houses, commercial and recreational fishing associations, water districts, local government, and the California Bay Delta farmers. This bill overrides a bipartisan local settlement to restore the San Joaquin River that ended 18 years of costly litigation and uncertainty. This bill guts the review process for water projects in California's Central Valley and eliminates science-based protections for many species required under both California law and the U.S. Endangered Species Act. There's simply no reason to support legislation that has myriad of unintended consequences, is an attack on certainty, and is an attack on issues that should be decided, frankly, by states and stakeholders. H.R. 1837 would eliminate desperately needed protections for fisheries, threatening thousands of fishing jobs and millions of dollars in income that sustains families, as evidenced by the impact seen during the first ever closures of California salmon fisheries in 2008 and 2009 due to collapsing runs. This bill is a recipe for lawsuit after lawsuit, an attack on a century of state leadership on water law, and a dismissal of the consensus agreement that the people of California have reached without the needless meddling of this body, without those from other states being called upon to settle a California matter of water. Mr. Speaker, this bill is a solution in search of a problem, a bill that ends up creating more problems for more people than the problem it's trying to solve. Simply put, this bill is cutting off the nose to spite the face. My state, along with 17 others, stand to get harmed over in the process, particularly by the dangerous precedent of federal second-guessing of local water rights. If this bill were really about the Delta smelt, then it should be drafted more narrowly. If this bill were really about jobs, then take into account the jobs of the salmon industry, which the bill would decimate. Take those concerns to local stakeholders, to the state of California, and work out a solution that's in the best interest of California citizens. Unfortunately, this bill is not about real problems. It's about scoring political points and sound bites. I urge my colleagues to join me on a no vote on the rule and the underlying bill and defeat the previous question. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Colorado yields back. The gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In addition to restoring agricultural productivity in this area, what has been referred to as America's salad bowl, this bill is a comprehensive piece of legislation which would reduce federal spending by $300 million by allowing certain water users presently obligated to repay federal loans on water projects in this area to repay those loans early on a penalty-free basis. This is a bill that, in addition, as we are facing unprecedented debt, this bill would stop wasteful spending, terminates over $1 billion in unproven and unnecessary federal spending projects, and it codifies the historic, previously agreed upon bipartisan state and federal agreement known as the Bay Delta Accord. It's pro-environment by restoring warm water fish habitats. It also protects northern California waterfowl habitat and still helps those who are trying to make a living as farmers in this area. You know, Mr. Speaker, in this body we always use comparatives and superlatives at the drop of the hat, or any other cliche you wish to use. If a bird flies over this Capitol, we will talk about it in superlatives. We often do that. We talk about bills being so important. In this case, I think superlatives are appropriate. This is he here? This is a significant bill that is life and death for these farmers, and it is unique. Even though it deals with California, there is no other state that has this particular problem. We are not setting any precedent for anywhere else, and I yield the balance of my time to the Speaker.
The Chair recognizes the Speaker of the House.
Well, let me thank my colleague for yielding, and my colleagues know that I don't often come to the floor and speak on bills. But as I saw this bill coming up today, I thought to myself, here is a perfect example of government getting in the way. You know, I never thought my wildest dreams I'd ever run for public office, ever seek to come here to Congress. But as a small businessman, I was concerned about the ever-growing size of the federal government, the ever-growing reach of the federal government. I saw it in my own business, I saw it with my suppliers, saw it with my customers. And out of that frustration, I came here because I thought government was too big, spent too much, and was far too intrusive into our economy and, frankly, our society. You look at this bill, and it's a perfect example of the overreach of government. We've got a group of people in California who don't like production agriculture. I think that using water to grow crops to feed the world is environmentally dangerous. And they're using a law for the Endangered Species Law for what I would describe as an unintended purpose. They're using a law to shut down production agriculture that they don't like and abusing a law that was created by this Congress. It is wrong, and it should not stand. Secondly, here we are in a country where the American people are asking, where are the jobs? The President says he's doing everything he can to help create more jobs in America. Well, here's a situation where we've got tens of thousands of farmers and those who work on those farms in the Central Valley of California being denied the use of their own land, being denied the labor to feed their own families because someone is abusing the law. This is a good bill and ought to pass.
My time.
Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
I move the previous question and yield back the balance of my time.
All time having expired, the question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. The ayes have it, and the resolution is adopted.
Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Colorado.
On that, I request the yeas and the nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 and Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on ordering the previous question will be followed by 5-minute votes on adopting the resolution if ordered and agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote.
The House has been debating the rule for a bill that would alter water regulations in California's San Joaquin Valley. This is a procedural vote. A vote on the rule is next. If the rule passes, there'll be an hour of general debate and 9 amendments to be considered. The legislation, sponsored by Representative Devin Nunes of California, Congressional Quarterly writes that it's a bill that modifies California water laws and agreements. It would facilitate increased water access for agriculture and municipal use while limiting the enforcement or consideration of environmental rules and regulations. The Stockton, California newspaper The Record reports that Representative Nunes has said the legislation is intended to prevent, quote, future California man-made droughts. referring to reductions in water supply to protect endangered fish. They also point out that California Senators Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer opposed the bill. In a related story, the San Francisco Chronicle reports that the winter so far in California, one of the driest on record, with the content of the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada at nearly just 30% of its normal for this time of year. So the House consideration of this bill will take up much of the rest of the afternoon, an hour of general debate, 9 amendments, and this is the previous question vote, and then 2 5-minute votes. One of those will be a vote on the rule. Over in the Senate today, there's been some discussion on the transportation bill, possible roll call votes this afternoon. We do know an amendment offered by Missouri Republican Roy Blunt will likely come up for a vote tomorrow. His amendment would allow health insurance plans to decline to cover an item if it's against the issuer's religious beliefs. So look for an amendment vote likely in the Senate on Thursday. The Hill reports that Senator Schumer said today that Blunt amendment amounts to a contraception ban, but Senator Blunt, in response to Senator Schumer's charge, told the Hill today that his statement that his amendment is not designed to target contraception. You can follow the Senate debate on transportation and other issues on our companion network, C-SPAN 2. Well, you just saw the Speaker speaking in favor of the water bill. He's just back from the White House. President Obama meeting today with the 4 top Republican and Democratic leaders, the first such meeting, the Associated Press says, since July, when the administration and Congress were fiercely negotiating to avoid a government default. The Associated Press says the meeting comes after bipartisan majorities in Congress passed an extension of the payroll tax cut sought by the administration. It also comes amid budding efforts to pass bipartisan legislation to give support to small businesses. So no news conference so far after that meeting at the White House, but that wrapped up just a short while ago. The House began business this morning at 10 o'clock, and the opening speech was from David Dreyer of California, announcing today that after this term, his 16th term in Congress, he will step down. He will retire from Congress. And during this 15-minute vote, we'll show you this morning's speech.
Mr. Speaker, what I'm about to announce will not come as much of a surprise, but we all know that this institution has an abysmally low approval rating, and the American people are asking for change in Congress. And so I'm announcing today that I will leave the Congress at the end of this year. Now, I take the unusual step of announcing it from here in the well of the House because I am a proud institutionalist. I believe that this institution is as great as it has ever been. And, Mr. Speaker, I announce it from here because between the Rules Committee upstairs, where you serve with me, Mr. Speaker, pro tem, and the House floor, this is where the people of California sent me to represent them. Now, as we look at the challenges that lie ahead, they are very, very great. I deliberated over this decision, and I have to say that 3 years ago I contemplated leaving at the end of that Congress, but ultimately made a decision that I wanted to continue to serve through this term. And I wanted to do so in hopes that we would win the majority with a goal of pursuing the 4-point platform that I had always run on, that being the pursuit of a free economy, limited government, a strong national defense, and personal freedom. And, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to work with not just my Republican colleagues, but my Democratic colleagues as well, working in a bipartisan way to accomplish a number of things. First, it was absolutely essential that we do everything to end the course that we had been on that ultimately brought us an 82% increase in non-defense discretionary spending, and I'm happy to say that we've turned the corner on that. Second, after years of languishing, we were finally able to pass 3 trade agreements that will create good jobs for union and non-union workers in this country by virtue of having passed the Panama, Colombia, and South Korea free trade agreements. I also believe that it's very important for us to recognize, as we look at our national security, the notion of people all over the world who are seeking to determine their own futures has created a wonderful opportunity for us. And the House Democracy Partnership, another strong bipartisan organization, has just now partnered with its 17th country in Central Asia to help the legislative bodies strengthen and have the kind of independence and oversight of their executive branch that we have a tendency to take for granted here. And fourth, Mr. Speaker, I felt very strongly, again working in a bipartisan way, that it was essential to ensure that both Democrats and Republicans have the opportunity to have their ideas heard through their amendments on the floor of the House of Representatives. Now, I do believe, again, Mr. Speaker, that this is the greatest deliberative body known to man. We've got a great deal of work that lies ahead throughout this year. But I'm looking forward to following the Madisonian directive that members of Congress, after serving here, should go out and live with the laws that have passed. And I will say that as passionately as we've been pursuing a pro-growth, jobs-creating agenda, I look forward to doing that myself as I move into the private sector next year. And Mr. Speaker, I will say that I want to express my appreciation. I want to express my appreciation, Mr. Speaker, to lots of people. Of course, the volunteers, family and friends, supporters, and the people who've offered prayers for our country on a regular basis. And I also want to, most important, express my appreciation, Mr. Speaker, to the people of California who, back in 1978, when I was 25 years old, living in the dormitory at my alma mater, Claremont McKenna College, they gave me the nomination for my party. And it's been a very, very exciting time. And I also want to say, Mr. Speaker, that I express my appreciation to the very, very dedicated public servants in my office in California and my offices here in Washington for their commitment to do the best job possible to help me represent the people of California. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Los Angeles area Representative David Dreyer announcing that he will retire at the end of his term, his 16th term. Just want to let you know we have posted that speech and also his written statement online at our website at cspan.org. On the floor, a bill that deals with the Central Valley of California, the San Joaquin Valley. This is the procedural question ahead of the vote on the rule for a bill that would change water regulations in the San Joaquin Valley in California. If the rule passes, it's an hour of general debate and 9 amendments included as well. Well, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke is on Capitol Hill today for the first of 2 days of testimony, giving his semi-annual monetary report today before the House Financial Services Committee, and tomorrow he'll be before the Senate Banking Committee. He said this morning the Federal Reserve is sticking with its plan to hold interest rates at record low levels. He spoke before the Financial Services Committee this morning. We're going to show you some of his opening statement and that of the chairman, Spencer Backus, as well.
This hearing will come to order. We meet today to receive the semi-annual report to Congress by the Chairman of the Board of the Federal Reserve System on the conduct of monetary policy and the state of the economy. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3F2, opening statements are limited to the Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the full committee and the Chair and Ranking Minority Member of the Subcommittee on Domestic Monetary Policy and Technology for a period of 8 minutes on each side. Without objection, all members' written statements will be made a part of the record. For purposes of opening statements, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. In my opening statement today, I'm going to avoid making any predictions about future events since I do not have a crystal ball, nor do you, Mr. Chairman. Instead, I'm going to address 2 subjects, the need for long-term entitlement reform and the Federal Reserve's dual mandate. For the last 3 years, we've operated in a low-interest rate environment, which has artificially lowered the cost of debt servicing. This temporary respite will not last forever. Ed? Thank you. Let me start. For the last 3 years, we've operated in a low-interest rate environment, which has artificially lowered the cost of our debt servicing. This temporary respite will not last forever. Chairman Bernanke, in each of your past appearances before this committee, you and I have discussed the dangers to the U.S. economy posed by our record levels of debt and deficits and the critical need for entitlement reform. We have discussed how long-term restructuring of our entitlement programs will have clear benefits for our economy today and will give our country a greater chance of success in the long term. Unfortunately and sadly, too few in Washington appear to be listening to this discussion. Let's have order in the committee and respect all the members, and that will go for the staff too. We have discussed how long-term restructuring of our entitlement programs will have clear benefits for our economy today and will give our country a greater chance of success in the long term. Fortunately and sadly, too few in Washington appear to be listening to this discussion. Your appearance here today is yet another opportunity for us to have this important dialogue, and it's my hope that Congress and the White House will join together and address entitlement reform. And we've discussed, this is not something the Federal Reserve can do. You've kept interest rates low, has given us an opportunity, but it's not an opportunity that will last forever. Your appearance is also an opportunity for us to have another important dialogue, this one on the Federal Reserve's dual mandate. And you discussed this in your opening statement. The Federal Reserve's conduct of monetary policy through the manipulation of interest rates and its control of the money supply implies a certain level of government management of the economy. While this makes some Americans uncomfortable and makes me uncomfortable at times, there's a general recognition of the need for an independent central bank to set monetary policy. Yet if one closely examines the Federal Reserve's dual mandate, price stability and maximum employment, it quickly becomes apparent that while the first part of that mandate involves monetary policy, the second is largely a function of economic policy. You acknowledge this, Chairman Bernanke, in your testimony for today's hearing when you state that, quote, while maximum employment stands on an equal footing with price stability as an objective of monetary policy, the maximum level of employment in an economy is largely determined by non-monetary factors that affect the structure and dynamics of the labor market. By giving the Federal Reserve a mandate that includes maximum employment, it is fair to ask whether we have surrendered too much control over the economy to a government agency and whether that mandate is more centrally focused on monetary policy would be a better approach. In other words, Federal Reserve would continue to deal with monetary policy but would not have responsibility or the burden, and really you don't have the power to control economic events. Indeed, for the first 65 years of your existence, the Federal Reserve did not operate under a dual mandate. It was only in 1977 that Congress passed a law requiring the Federal Reserve to promote both maximum employment and price stability. It may therefore be appropriate for Congress to revisit the dual mandate with an eye towards refocusing the Fed on its core mission of long-term price stability and other matters that constitute monetary policy. The Congress, on the other hand, could focus on employment, and because it is and continues to be our responsibility to focus on jobs. Chairman Bernanke, I know all of us look forward to your testimony. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Frank.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will accept your invitation for a civil debate on these subjects. Let me begin with deficit reduction, which I agree is a great requirement. But I disagree with this focus which you reflect on entitlement reform. Before I reduce Social Security payments to elderly people, particularly, for example, those who want to reduce the cost of living increase so that 82-year-old women living on a fairly modest income would get less of a compensation for inflation, particularly since health care costs are a major cost for them and go up more than regular inflation. I think we should withdraw from Afghanistan. I support the President's decision to withdraw troops from Iraq, and I note that many on the Republican side have been critical of that. We do have to reduce spending, but we spend far more as a favor to much of the rest of the world on the military than we need to. And before I will impose costs on elderly Americans, I should add, I regard the enactment of Social Security and Medicare as two of the great accomplishments of this country in the 20th century. They were opposed on partisan grounds, both of them when they came. Yes, there are some areas where there can be some greater efficiencies. But the notion that that's the major place you get savings, when we continue to spend 5.4% or more or less, but around 5% of our gross domestic product on the military, while our NATO allies spend 1.7% and get the benefit of an enormous subsidy from us, makes no sense. When people are critical of the President's proposal to begin to withdraw from Afghanistan, I think it ought to be done more quickly, and then tell me that they want to cut the deficit and don't want to raise taxes, I fear for Social Security and Medicare, because to do that would require cuts in those programs that go far beyond efficiencies or efforts to sort of reduce what goes to people in the upper income brackets. Secondly, I would particularly welcome this debate on the dual mandate, because I think there was an illogic in the way it was just stated. It is true that the Federal Reserve has more direct control over monetary policy than it does over employment. But the point is that monetary policy, the level of interest rates, has an effect on employment. The notion that they are unconnected obviously isn't the case. The Chairman didn't say that, but I think that's the implication of saying that the Federal Reserve shouldn't be dealing with employment. In fact, let me give an example. We have had a debate about what should have been done because of mortgages being given that shouldn't have been given. One argument has been that the Federal Reserve should have shut down the whole economy to some extent by raising interest rates, that it should have deflated the bubble by raising interest rates, with a consequent negative effect on employment as well as other things. Many of us believe instead the Federal Reserve, under Mr. Bernanke's predecessor, not him, should have used the authority this Congress gave him in 1994 to prevent the bad mortgages. That is, that there should have been more targeted efforts to deal with this, rather than deflate the economy as a whole as a way of dealing with that problem. We do have a serious employment problem. It is to Mr. Bernanke's credit that he has taken seriously this dual mandate, and this shouldn't be a partisan issue. I think people may sometimes forget that Mr. Bernanke, whose work in this job I greatly admire, was one of the highest-ranking appointees on economic matters by President George W. Bush. He was chair, I believe, of the Council of Economic Advisors. It was Mr. Bush who appointed him to the Federal Reserve. He is an example of bipartisanship. And what I find is that a lot of my colleagues like bipartisanship in principle. They just have never found an example of it that they want to tolerate. Mr. Bernanke's concern for inflation and employment is a very good one. And the notion that we should say, okay, to the Federal Reserve, you don't pay attention to employment, we'll handle that, and you should simply try to prevent inflation, invites them to impose an interest rate regime which would be unfortunate. And by the way, I would contrast the Federal Reserve under our dual mandate with the European Central Bank until recently with their unitary mandate of just inflation. I think, frankly, that the Federal Reserve's record in trying to deal with the balanced economy has been a better one. And to some extent, the European Central Bank is improved, partly because they have almost explicitly been following the model of the U.S. Federal Reserve, which has cooperated with them. So, yes, I think we should reduce the deficit, but to talk about doing that by cutting Social Security and Medicare to the exclusion, in fact, many of my colleagues want to spend even more on the military as this great gift to the rest of the world so they don't have to spend on their own. And the notion that the Federal Reserve, a very powerful economic entity, should set interest rates with no regard for their impact on employment, both seem to be wrong, and I think the country would benefit from that kind of debate.
I thank the gentleman, and let me simply say that I think we could address both of them. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And as you know, I have a son that served in the Marines, well,
Mr. Chairman, if we're getting an extra thing, I was simply responding to what you said, and you are representative of a large group that talks about entitlements, and the military only comes up as an afterthought.
Well, I think it needs to be a grand bargain. We've discussed that, and I think we agree on that. And everything ought to be on the table, but without entitlement reforms, we won't get there.
Mr. Chairman, are we going to continue this debate after our 5 minutes? I don't know.
Mr. Paulson, at this time, Mr. Paul is recognized. Your thorn in the flesh. For 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Chairman Bernanke. You know, I guess over the last 30 or 40 years, I have criticized the Fed on occasion. But the Congress deserves some criticism, too. The Federal Reserve is a creature of the Congress, and if we don't know what the Fed is doing, we have the authority, and we certainly have the authority to pursue a lot more oversight, which I would like to see. So although the Fed is on the receiving end, and I think rightfully so when you look at the record, I mean, the Fed's been around for 99 years, almost a few years before you took it over, and 99%, 98% of the dollar value is gone from the 1913 dollar. So that's not really a very good record. And I think what we're witnessing today is the end stages of a grand experiment, a philosophic experiment on total fiat money. Yes, they've been debasing currencies for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they always end badly. They always return to market-based money, which is commodity money, gold and silver. But this experiment is something different than we've ever had before, and it started in 1971, where we were actually given an opportunity in many ways to be the issuer of the fiat currency, and we had way too many benefits from that than people realized. But it's gone on for 40 years, and people keep arguing from the other side of this argument that it's working, it's doing well, and yet from my viewpoint and the viewpoint of the free market economists, all it's doing is building a bigger and bigger bubble. And the free market economists were the ones who predicted the NASDAQ bubble, the housing bubbles, but we never hear from the Keynesian liberal economists and the central bankers and saying, watch out, there's a bubble out there, there's too much credit, too many problems there, there's a housing bubble, we have to deal with it. Usually we get reassurance from the Fed on that. But I believe there's a logical reason for this, because the Federal Reserve is given a responsibility to protect the value of the dollar. That's what stable prices are all about. But we don't even have a definition of a dollar. You know, we ask about the definition of a dollar and say, oh, it's whatever it's by. Well, every single day it buys less than the next day. And to me, it's sort of like building an economy and having economic planning like a builder had a yardstick that changed its value every single day. I mean, just think of the kind of a building we have. This is why we have this imbalance in our economic system. But it was a system designed to pyramid debt. We have a debt-based system. The more debt we have and the more debt the Federal Reserve buys, the more currency they can print. And they monetize this debt. And no wonder we're in a debt crisis. It's worldwide. I think it's something we've never experienced before. And I think the conclusion will be a vindication either for sound money, or if you win the argument and say, yes, we are great managers, we know how to do it, we want the credit for the good times, and we want the credit for getting us out of those good times. I mean, I think within a few years we're going to know. Of course, I'm betting that the market is smarter, commodity money is smarter, nobody's smart enough to have central economic planning. So I'm anxiously waiting for this day for the conclusion, because reforms have to come. They're already talking about, when you see Robert Zoellick talking about monetary reforms and talking about gold, our time has come for serious discussion on monetary reform. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Paul, for that statement. And this time, Mr. White is recognized for 3 minutes. The gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the opportunity to substitute for my friend Lacey Clay, the ranking member of the subcommittee, because he's unable to be here because of a conflict. And I'm glad to see my friend President Paul back from the campaign trail.
On this vote, the yeas are 241, the nays are 178. The previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor will say aye.